"Step out of the vehicle, ma'am." The command cut clean through the late afternoon air, sharp enough to turn heads across the grocery store parking lot. Officer Daniel Hayes stepped out of his cruiser, the door shutting with a solid thud that echoed off rows of parked SUVs and shopping carts rattling in the distance. The sun hung low, casting long golden lines across the asphalt, heat still rising faintly from the pavement after a 78-degree day. His radio crackled once, then went quiet. Suspicious individual. Black female. Possible loitering. That's what dispatch had said, and in his mind, that was enough. 30 feet ahead, near a silver sedan with its trunk open, stood a woman in a navy blouse and simple slacks, placing grocery bags carefully inside like each item mattered. She didn't rush, didn't fumble, just moved with a quiet precision that didn't match the urgency Hayes already felt building in his chest. He adjusted his belt, posture tightening, eyes narrowing the way they always did when something didn't sit right. "Ma'am," he called again, louder this time, boots pressing against the pavement as he closed the distance. A cart rolled lazily past, pushed by a man who slowed just enough to watch. The woman turned slowly, not startled, not defensive, just aware. Her face was calm, composed in a way that didn't register as fear or confusion. It was something else, something steady. Hayes had seen thousands of faces on the job, nervous, angry, guilty, defensive, but this one didn't fit any category he trusted. "Is there a problem, officer?" she asked, voice even, measured, carrying just enough to reach him without raising itself. He studied her. Mid-40s, maybe early 50s. No sudden movements. No attempt to leave. But that calm, it pressed against his instincts like a contradiction he couldn't resolve. "We've had reports of suspicious activity in this area," he said, words rehearsed, controlled. "I'm going to need you to step away from the vehicle." The wind shifted slightly, rustling a loose receipt near the curb. Somewhere behind them, a child laughed, then stopped when their parent tugged them closer. The world didn't freeze, not completely, but it leaned in. The woman glanced briefly at the open trunk, then back at him. "Officer," she said, still calm, still grounded. "I'm loading my groceries." Hayes took another step forward. "I understand that, ma'am. I still need you to comply." There. It was the edge. Not loud, not aggressive, but firm enough to draw a line she hadn't crossed. She held his gaze for a moment longer than most people would. Not defiant, not submissive, just present. Then she slowly closed the trunk, the soft click of metal sealing the space between them. The sound landed heavier than it should have. Hayes felt it in his chest, though he couldn't explain why. "Please place your hands where I can see them," he added, voice tightening just slightly, as if certainty required volume. The woman lifted her hands, smooth, controlled, palms open. No shaking, no hesitation, just compliance without surrender. And something about that, something about the way she didn't shrink, didn't argue, didn't plead, made Hayes feel, for the briefest second, like he was stepping into a moment that didn't belong to him. But the radio on his shoulder hummed faintly again, pulling him back, grounding him in protocol, in assumption, in the version of the story he believed he understood. Around them, phones began to rise. Not many, just a few. Enough. The light shifted as a cloud passed over the sun, dimming the gold into something cooler, flatter. Hayes reached for his cuffs, the metal catching a sliver of fading light, and for a heartbeat. Just one. Everything felt quieter than it should have been, like the air itself was waiting to see what he would do next. Alana Brooks had learned long ago that stillness could be louder than protest, that sometimes the strongest response was not resistance but presence. And as she stood there with her hands calmly raised in the fading light of a North Carolina evening, she did not see a parking lot or a uniform, or even the small circle of strangers watching from a cautious distance. She saw something older, something familiar. The quiet pattern of being misread before a single word was fully heard, and yet her breathing stayed even, measured, the way it had during years of hearings where every syllable carried weight and consequence, the way it had when she first stood behind a bench with eyes on her that doubted her before she ever spoke. And now here she was again, not in a courtroom, but in a grocery store parking lot off Route 17, the smell of warm asphalt and faint gasoline lingering in the air, her sedan still ticking softly from the heat of the drive. A carton of eggs settled carefully in the trunk beside a gallon of milk and a paper bag folded just so. Details that grounded her in the ordinary even as the moment began to tilt into something else, something heavier. Officer Hayes watching her with a certainty that did not come from evidence, but from instinct. And she recognized that look because she had seen it across courtrooms too, in witnesses, in jurors, in officers who believed the story before the facts had a chance to speak. "I am going to ask you again to keep your hands visible," he said, his voice controlled but carrying a tension that suggested he was already committed to a version of events that had not yet unfolded, and Alana nodded slightly, not in submission but in acknowledgement, her palms open, fingers relaxed, her posture upright, composed, her eyes steady on him without challenge, without fear, just clarity. Because she knew that escalation often began in the smallest misunderstandings, in the slightest shift of tone, and she would not be the one to introduce it. A woman nearby paused with a grocery bag pressed against her hip, watching with a furrowed brow. A teenage boy lowered his phone halfway, then lifted it again, uncertain whether this was something worth recording or something he should walk away from. The world continuing in fragments around them, carts rolling, engines starting, doors closing. But here in this narrow space between two parked cars time seemed to stretch, thin, and fragile. "Do you have identification on you?" Hayes asked, his hand hovering near his belt as if proximity to authority might anchor the situation, and Alana answered with the same calm precision she carried into every courtroom. "Yes, officer. It is in my purse on the front seat." Her voice smooth, unhurried, every word placed carefully, not for him alone, but for the moment itself, for the space that was beginning to gather attention, because she understood something he did not yet see, that this was no longer just an interaction, it was a record in the making, a narrative forming in real time, and narratives, once formed, had consequences. Hayes gestured toward the car. "Slowly. I want you to retrieve it." And she moved exactly as instructed, each motion deliberate, her hand lowering inch by inch, the fabric of her sleeve brushing softly against her wrist, the car door handle cool beneath her fingers as she opened it just enough to reach inside, the faint scent of leather and paper rising from within, her purse resting where she had left it, everything in place, everything ordinary. And for a moment she allowed herself a single breath deeper than the rest, not because she was afraid, but because she was aware of how thin the line was between being seen and being judged, between being heard and being decided upon. And as she retrieved her identification, holding it carefully between two fingers before turning back toward him, there was a quiet certainty in her gaze, not of what would happen next, but of who she was regardless of it, a certainty built over years, over cases, over rooms where her voice had shaped outcomes that carried far beyond their walls. And now that same voice waited, steady and restrained, as she extended the card toward him, the last trace of sunlight catching along its edge, reflecting briefly across his uniform, as if offering one final chance for the moment to shift before it settled into something neither of them could undo. Officer Daniel Hayes took the card between his fingers with a grip that was firmer than necessary, not aggressive but deliberate, as if control could be reinforced through pressure alone, and for a brief second his eyes dropped to the name printed across the surface, then lifted again almost immediately, not long enough to absorb, not long enough to question, because something in him had already decided that whatever this was, it needed to follow through, needed to resolve in a way that confirmed the instinct he had trusted when he stepped out of the cruiser, and instinct, once committed to, rarely welcomed contradiction. The late afternoon light fading further as a thin cloud passed overhead, softening the edges of everything, muting colors, flattening contrast, turning the scene into something quieter but no less tense. "Alana Brooks," he read aloud, his tone neutral but clipped, like a box being checked rather than a fact being considered, and he glanced again at the card. This time just a fraction longer, enough to register the seal, the formatting, the weight of it, but still not enough to let it interrupt the narrative forming in his mind, because the story he believed was already moving forward, already structured, already aligned with the call that had brought him here, suspicious individual, possible loitering, and everything else had to fit inside that frame, even if it did not quite align, even if something about the woman in front of him did not match the profile he carried in his head. "Where are you coming from today, ma'am?" he asked, shifting his stance slightly. The radio on his shoulder emitting a low hum that blended into the distant sound of traffic from the main road. And Alana answered without hesitation, her voice as steady as before. "From the courthouse," she said. The words simple, direct, carrying no embellishment, no attempt to persuade. Just truth delivered without urgency. And for a moment, just a brief flicker, something in Hayes's expression tightened. Not recognition, not yet, but the smallest hint of dissonance. Like a detail that did not quite belong where it had been placed. A woman standing near the cart return glanced at another shopper, their eyes meeting in a silent exchange that said something was off. Something was unfolding that did not feel routine. And still Hayes continued, because routine was what he knew, what he trusted. "Which courthouse?" he asked. And there was a slight edge now, subtle but present, as if the question itself was a test rather than a clarification, and Alana held his gaze, not challenging, not retreating, just present. "The federal courthouse downtown," she replied, her tone unchanged, the same calm, measured cadence that had carried her through years of proceedings where every word mattered. And again that flicker crossed his face, just for a second, the kind of moment that could have shifted everything if it had been allowed to expand. But it did not. Because doubt requires space, and Hayes was not giving it any, not yet. He turned the card slightly in his hand, the light catching along its surface, reflecting back toward him in a thin line that traced across his fingers, and behind him, a second cruiser rolled slowly into the lot, its tires crunching softly over loose gravel near the edge of the pavement. Another officer stepping out, scanning the scene with quick, practiced movements, reinforcing the moment, adding weight to it. Turning a single interaction into something larger, something more official, more fixed, and Alana noticed it. Of course she did. Not with alarm but with awareness, the way one notices a shift in a courtroom when additional counsel enters, when the balance of the room adjusts without a word being spoken, and still she remained composed, her shoulders relaxed, her breathing even, her presence anchored not in the situation but in herself. Because she understood something that the moment had not yet revealed, that identity does not change under pressure, only perception does. And as Hayes handed the card briefly toward his partner for a quick glance, the air between them seemed to tighten, not visibly, not dramatically, but enough that even the distant sounds of carts and engines felt slightly muted, as if the world itself was waiting for the next piece to fall into place. And in that quiet narrowing of time, there was a subtle shift, not in action, not yet, but in weight, in the unseen gravity of what was about to unfold. A gravity that neither officer fully recognized, and yet it was already there, settling in, shaping the moment, before anyone had the chance to stop it. The second officer, a taller man with a broader frame and a slower, more deliberate way of moving, stepped closer as Hayes handed over the identification, his eyes scanning it with a longer pause. A deeper red, the kind that suggested he was not just looking but processing, and for a moment the balance between them shifted slightly, not enough to change the situation, but enough to introduce a crack in the certainty that had carried Hayes this far. "This says federal," the second officer murmured under his breath, not loud enough for the crowd but audible between them, and Hayes gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, as if acknowledging the detail without allowing it to alter the course already in motion. Because stepping back now would require more than recognition. It would require reconsideration, and reconsideration meant admitting that the first judgment might not have been complete, might not have been right. And that was a threshold he had not yet reached. "Ma'am, I am going to need you to step away from the vehicle and keep your hands visible while we sort this out," Hayes said again, reinforcing the command as if repetition could solidify authority, and Alana complied without hesitation, taking one small step back from the car, her movements controlled, her posture unchanged, her eyes steady, not challenging, not yielding, just present in a way that seemed to hold the moment together even as it threatened to unravel. The second officer glanced once more at the card, then back at her, something in his expression quieter, less certain, but still bound by the structure of the situation, by the presence of his partner, by the unspoken agreement that once a course of action had begun, it needed to be followed through unless something undeniable forced it to stop, and right now, nothing had reached that level. Not yet. A faint breeze moved through the lot, lifting the corner of a receipt near the curb, carrying with it the distant hum of traffic and the soft murmur of voices from onlookers who had not left, who had instead drawn a little closer, their attention now fixed, their phones held just high enough to capture without intruding, the world narrowing further around this single point of interaction. "Do you understand why we are here?" Hayes asked, his tone firm, controlled, but with an undercurrent that suggested he was reinforcing not just the situation for her, but for himself, and Alana answered with the same calm precision she had maintained from the beginning. "You said there was a report," she replied, her voice even, her words measured, each one placed without urgency, without resistance, and there was a pause, a small one, but noticeable, the kind that stretched just long enough to make space for something else to enter, something like doubt, something like reconsideration, but again, it did not fully form, because Hayes stepped forward slightly, closing the distance by a few inches, reasserting the structure, the control, the direction of the moment. "Until we verify everything, you are being detained," he said, the words landing with a finality that seemed to settle into the air, anchoring the situation in a way that made it harder to reverse, harder to question. And Alana did not react the way many would. She did not argue, did not raise her voice, did not attempt to assert her position in a way that would escalate. Instead, she held her ground in a different way, through composure, through presence, through a quiet steadiness that did not depend on the situation to validate it. And in that stillness, there was something else, something that neither officer fully recognized, a depth of awareness that extended beyond the immediate moment, beyond the parking lot, beyond the small circle of attention gathering around them. Because Alana understood systems, she understood process, she understood how moments like this did not exist in isolation but became part of something larger, something recorded, something remembered. And as the second officer shifted his weight, glancing once more at the identification in his hand, then back at Hayes, there was a subtle hesitation, a fraction of a second where a different choice could have been made, a different path taken, but it passed, quickly, quietly, and the structure held, the moment continuing forward along the line it had been set upon, the light dimming just slightly as the sun dipped lower, casting longer shadows across the pavement, stretching the figures of everyone present into elongated shapes that blurred at the edges, as if even the environment was softening the boundaries of what was happening, but not stopping it, not yet. And in that quiet, tightening space, the next step was already forming, inevitable not because it had to be, but because no one had chosen to interrupt it. The word detained did not echo loudly. It settled, heavy and quiet, like something placed carefully on a table that no one dared to touch. And for a moment the entire scene seemed to hold its breath, the distant hum of traffic fading into the background, the soft clatter of a shopping cart rolling somewhere beyond the rows of cars sounding distant, almost disconnected from what was happening here. And Alana Brooks remained exactly where she was, her hands still visible, her posture unchanged, her breathing even, as if the word had not altered her, as if it had simply become another fact to acknowledge rather than something to resist. And yet the weight of it was real, not in her reaction but in the way it shifted everything around her, the onlookers drawing a fraction closer, their attention sharpening, their phones steady now, no longer uncertain, because something about the tone, about the finality of that word, had signaled that this was no longer a routine exchange, it was something else, something that carried consequence. "I understand," she said, her voice calm, measured, not agreeing with the situation but recognizing it, and that distinction, subtle as it was, hung in the air between them, unnoticed by Hayes, who had already moved to the next step, his hand reaching toward his belt again, not hurried, not aggressive, but procedural, as if he were following a sequence that had been practiced so many times it no longer required thought, only execution. The second officer shifted slightly, his gaze moving between Hayes and Alana, something in his expression tightening again, a hesitation that returned but did not take hold, because the structure of the moment, the presence of protocol, the expectation of follow-through, all pressed forward, leaving little room for pause. "Please turn around," Hayes said, his voice firm, controlled, carrying that same edge of certainty that had guided him from the beginning. And Alana did not immediately move, not out of defiance, but out of precision, her eyes meeting his once more, not searching for permission, not challenging authority, but marking the moment, acknowledging it fully before stepping into it. Because she understood something deeply ingrained, that moments like this did not just pass, they became part of a record, part of a narrative that extended beyond the immediate. And when she turned, it was with the same deliberate control she had shown in every movement since the beginning, slow, composed, her hands remaining visible, her shoulders relaxed, her presence intact, the faint sound of fabric shifting as she adjusted her stance barely audible against the quiet tension that now filled the space. The second officer took a small step closer, not intervening, not stopping anything, but positioning himself as if to observe more closely, to witness, and perhaps, in some quiet way, to understand what was unfolding, though he did not yet act on that understanding. And Hayes proceeded, his movements methodical, the sound of metal faint but distinct as it caught the last sliver of daylight, a sound that seemed louder than it should have been in the stillness of the moment, and Alana felt it, not as fear, not as panic, but as a marker, a point in time that would not be forgotten, her expression unchanged, her breathing steady, her mind clear, because she had spent years in environments where pressure did not dictate response, where clarity mattered more than reaction, and here, in this parking lot, that same discipline held, even as the situation tightened around her, even as the presence of the second officer, the watching crowd, the dimming light, all converged into a single, focused moment, and somewhere beyond them, a car door closed, a distant voice called out, life continuing in fragments just outside the boundary of what was happening here. But inside that boundary, everything had narrowed, everything had condensed into this sequence of actions, this progression that had begun with a call and now moved forward with its own momentum. And as Hayes completed the procedure, stepping back just slightly, maintaining control of the space, there was a shift, subtle but undeniable, not in Alana, who remained composed, but in the atmosphere itself, a heaviness settling in, a recognition, unspoken but present, that something had crossed from assumption into action, from possibility into reality. And in that quiet transition, the moment became fixed, no longer something that could be easily redirected, but something that would carry forward, beyond this parking lot, beyond this fading evening light, into whatever came next. The back door of the cruiser opened with a muted mechanical click, not loud, not dramatic, just another small sound that marked a shift in place. And as Alana Brooks stepped toward it, guided by presence rather than force, the air felt different, cooler somehow, as if the fading sunlight had taken something with it, leaving behind a quieter, more enclosed version of the world, the interior of the vehicle dim, the faint scent of vinyl and clean upholstery settling around her as she lowered herself into the seat with the same composed precision she had carried through every moment before, her hands resting calmly, her posture upright despite the confined space. And when the door closed, the outside noise softened instantly, the distant voices, the rolling carts, the idle engines all reduced to a low, indistinct hum, like the world had been placed behind glass. And for the first time since the interaction began, there was stillness, not the tense kind that precedes action, but the kind that allows thought to surface, that creates space between events. And Alana closed her eyes briefly, not to escape, not to withdraw, but to center, to mark the transition from one phase of the moment to the next, her breathing steady, measured, the rhythm unchanged, because composure, to her, was not a reaction, it was a constant, something cultivated long before this parking lot, long before this evening, something that did not depend on circumstance to exist. Outside, Hayes stood near the front of the cruiser, speaking quietly into his radio, his voice controlled, procedural, relaying details that now had to be documented, that would become part of an official account, his words blending into the static and response on the other end, while the second officer remained a few steps back, his gaze occasionally drifting toward the closed rear door, toward the figure now partially obscured by tinted glass, his expression thoughtful, though he said nothing, because whatever questions had begun to form had not yet found a place to land, had not yet become strong enough to interrupt the momentum of what had already been set in motion. Inside the cruiser, the light shifted again as the sun dipped lower, casting a soft, angled glow through the front windshield that stretched across the dashboard and just barely touched the edge of Alana's sleeve, a thin line of warmth in an otherwise muted space. And she noticed it, not as comfort, but as detail. Because details mattered, they always had. They were the pieces that built understanding, that shaped outcomes, that separated assumption from fact. And here, in this confined quiet, her mind did what it had been trained to do. It observed, it recorded, it held everything without judgment, without reaction, the timing, the sequence, the words, the presence of witnesses, the arrival of the second officer, the exact phrasing of the commands. All of it settling into place with a clarity that came not from tension, but from discipline, from years of navigating environments where precision was not optional, where every moment carried weight beyond itself. And yet beneath that clarity, there was something else, something softer, not fear, not anger, but a quiet acknowledgement of what this moment represented, not just for her, but for something larger, something that extended beyond a single interaction, beyond a single decision. And as she opened her eyes again, her gaze steady, her expression unchanged, she looked forward through the narrow gap between the seats, through the windshield where the sky had begun to shift into deeper shades of blue and gray. And for a brief moment, everything felt suspended, not resolved, not escalated, just held in a space between what had happened and what would come next. The engine of the cruiser humming softly as Hayes moved toward the driver's side, the door opening, then closing again with that same controlled finality. And as he settled into his seat, adjusting the mirror, his reflection briefly aligning with hers in the glass, there was a pause, small but real, a fraction of a second where the moment could have been reconsidered, where the weight of everything that had just unfolded could have been acknowledged differently. But it passed, like so many small opportunities do, unnoticed, and the vehicle shifted slightly as the engine engaged more fully, the quiet hum deepening, signaling that the moment was no longer contained to the parking lot, that it was beginning to move, carrying with it everything that had already been set into motion, everything that had yet to be understood. The cruiser pulled out of the parking lot slowly, its tires rolling over the faded white lines as the last traces of daylight slipped behind the horizon, and inside, the silence stretched, not empty but dense, filled with everything that had not yet been said. Officer Hayes keeping his eyes forward, hands steady on the wheel, the dashboard lights casting a soft blue glow across his uniform, while the second officer followed behind in the separate vehicle, his headlights reflecting faintly in the rearview mirror, a quiet reminder that this moment was no longer isolated. It was being carried forward, recorded in motion, and in the back seat, Alana Brooks remained composed, her gaze steady through the windshield, watching the road unfold in long, smooth lines, the familiar rhythm of movement grounding the space in a way that stillness could not. And for several minutes, no one spoke, the radio crackling occasionally with routine dispatch chatter that had nothing to do with this, nothing to do with her, yet somehow it all felt connected, part of the same system, the same structure that had brought them to this point. Until finally, Hayes exhaled quietly, a subtle shift in his posture betraying something beneath the surface, not doubt yet, but the beginning of it, the kind that starts as a question before it becomes a realization. And he reached for the radio again, his voice lower this time, more precise. "Dispatch, can you run a full verification on the identification I provided?" he said, the words careful, measured, as if choosing them required more attention now than it had before. And there was a pause on the other end, a brief delay that stretched just long enough to be noticed. Then the response came back, clear, official, carrying a tone that was no longer routine. "Copy that, stand by." And the silence that followed felt different, heavier, like the space between a question and an answer that matters. Hayes adjusted his grip on the wheel slightly, his jaw tightening just enough to register, and in the rearview mirror, his eyes flicked upward for a fraction of a second, catching the reflection of Alana's still, composed presence behind him, and something about that stillness pressed against him now in a way it had not before, no longer just unfamiliar, but significant. And then the radio came alive again, sharper this time, more focused. "Unit, confirm the name again," the dispatcher asked, and Hayes responded without hesitation, though his voice carried a new weight. "Alana Brooks," he said. And there was another pause, longer now, unmistakable, followed by a shift in tone that changed everything without raising volume. "Unit, be advised, that identification corresponds to a federal judge assigned to the district court." And the words landed quietly, but their impact moved through the vehicle like a ripple, subtle but undeniable. Hayes's eyes remained forward, but something in his expression stilled, not frozen, but recalibrating, the certainty that had guided him beginning to fracture, piece by piece, as the information settled into place. And for a moment, no one spoke. Not him, not the dispatcher, not the second officer who was now listening in from the trailing vehicle, the weight of the realization spreading across the space between them, filling it, reshaping it. And in the back seat, Alana did not move, did not react outwardly, but her gaze remained steady, her presence unchanged, because this was not new to her, not the misunderstanding, not the delay in recognition, not the moment when truth arrives after action has already been taken. She had seen it before, in different forms, in different rooms, and yet each time it carried its own weight, its own consequence. And as Hayes finally spoke again, his voice quieter now, stripped of the earlier edge, there was something else in it, something closer to awareness. "Copy that," he said, and the words felt smaller than they had before, less certain, more contained, as if the structure he had relied on had shifted beneath him, and the road ahead stretched on, illuminated by the steady beam of headlights. But now it felt different, not just a path forward, but a continuation of something that had already begun to turn, already begun to reveal itself. And inside the cruiser, the silence returned, but it was no longer the same silence. It carried knowledge now, and knowledge, once present, does not fade. It waits, it expands, it changes everything that follows. The cruiser did not stop immediately. Even after the words settled into the air, even after the confirmation had reshaped the meaning of everything that had already happened, it continued forward for another block, then another, as if momentum itself needed time to catch up with reality. And inside, Officer Hayes kept his eyes fixed on the road, but his grip on the steering wheel had changed, no longer firm with certainty, but measured, deliberate, as if each movement now required thought. Where before there had been none, the dashboard lights reflecting faintly across his face, highlighting the tension that had quietly replaced confidence. And in the rearview mirror, the reflection of Alana Brooks remained steady, unchanged, her posture still composed, her gaze forward, not pressing, not demanding, simply present in a way that made silence feel heavier, more revealing. And after a few seconds that stretched longer than they should have, Hayes slowed the vehicle, guiding it toward the side of the road, the tires rolling onto the gravel shoulder with a soft crunch that broke the rhythm of motion. And when the cruiser came to a full stop, the engine idling low beneath them, the world outside felt distant again, the passing headlights, the hum of evening traffic, all continuing as if nothing had shifted, even though everything had. Hayes exhaled slowly, the sound quiet but noticeable. And for a moment he did not turn around, did not speak, as if he was aligning something internally, recalibrating a sequence that had already been set in motion. And when he finally reached for the radio again, his voice carried a different tone, lower, controlled, but stripped of the earlier edge. "Dispatch, confirm full credentials and current assignment," he said. And the response came back almost immediately now, precise, unmistakable, confirmed, federal judge, active, assigned to the district court, credentials valid. And the finality of it left no space for interpretation, no room for adjustment, only acknowledgement. Hayes nodded slightly, though no one could see it, and for a brief second his eyes closed, not fully, just enough to register the weight of what had been set in motion before this confirmation arrived. And then he turned, slowly, his gaze meeting Alana's for the first time since the realization had taken hold. And in that moment, the space between them shifted again, no longer defined by authority alone, but by awareness. by the quiet understanding that the situation had moved beyond assumption into consequence. "Ma'am," he began, his voice careful now, measured in a way that suggested each word mattered. "There appears to have been a misidentification," and the phrase felt smaller than the moment, insufficient in a way that he seemed to recognize even as he said it, because what had occurred was not simply a mistake in identity. It was a chain of decisions built on incomplete understanding, and Alana listened without interruption, her expression unchanged, not dismissive, not accepting, just present, absorbing the words without reacting to them, because she understood something he was only beginning to see, that acknowledgement does not erase action. It only defines what follows. Hayes continued, "We are going to correct this immediately." And there was a pause, a brief one, where the weight of those words settled into the space between them, and the second officer's vehicle pulled in behind them, headlights illuminating the rear of the cruiser, adding another layer of light, another layer of presence to the moment. And inside, Alana finally spoke. Her voice calm, steady, unchanged from the beginning. "Officer," she said, and the single word carried more than its syllables, not in volume, but in clarity. "I have complied fully." And she let the statement rest there, not as an accusation, not as a challenge, but as a fact, simple, undeniable, and Hayes nodded again, this time more visibly, his posture shifting slightly as he reached toward the door handle. The movement slower now, deliberate, as if he was aware that every action from this point forward would carry weight, would be remembered, and as he stepped out of the vehicle, the cool evening air settling around him, the sounds of the world returning in fragments, the gravel underfoot, the distant hum of traffic, the faint murmur of voices from somewhere beyond. There was a quiet understanding forming, not spoken, not yet complete, but present, that this moment had already moved beyond correction. That whatever came next would not simply undo what had been done, but would define how it was carried forward. The rear door opened again with a softer sound this time, not abrupt, not commanding, but careful, as if even the mechanism understood the shift that had taken place, and the cool evening air moved gently into the space where Alana Brooks sat, carrying with it the faint scent of asphalt cooling after a long day, the distant rhythm of passing cars, the quiet hum of a world that had never paused for any of this. And she stepped out with the same composure she had carried from the beginning, her posture upright, her movements unhurried, her presence unchanged, as though the sequence of events had not altered who she was, only revealed something about everything around her. Officer Hayes stood a few feet away now, no longer positioned directly in front of her, his stance less rigid, his shoulders no longer squared with the same certainty, and the second officer remained near the rear of the vehicle, watching, not intervening, not speaking, but present in a way that suggested he understood more now than he had at the start. Understood that this moment had shifted beyond procedure into something that could not be undone by simple correction. Hayes cleared his throat slightly, a small, human gesture that broke the formal stillness. "Ma'am, you are free to go," he said, the words measured, careful, as if their weight required precision, and Alana looked at him, not with anger, not with relief, but with a quiet clarity that held the moment steady, her eyes reflecting the fading light as the sky deepened into a soft blue-gray, and for a second, neither of them moved. The space between them filled with everything that had happened, everything that could not be reversed, and then she nodded once. A simple acknowledgement, not of permission, but of conclusion, because she understood that endings, like beginnings, carried meaning beyond their surface. She turned slightly, her gaze moving briefly toward the road, the steady stream of headlights passing by, each one continuing forward without hesitation, without awareness of what had unfolded here, and then back to the officers, her voice calm, even, unchanged. "Officer Hayes," she said, using his name not as familiarity but as recognition, grounding the moment in specificity. "Accountability does not begin when the truth is confirmed, it begins when the decision is made." And she let the words settle, not forceful, not raised, but precise, each one placed with intention, the kind of statement that did not demand response because it did not need one. Hayes listened, his expression still, his earlier certainty replaced by something quieter, something that resembled understanding, though not yet fully formed, and he nodded slightly, not as agreement, but as acknowledgement of the weight carried in what she had said. The second officer shifted, his stance subtly, his gaze lowering for a moment before lifting again, as if reflecting on the sequence of events that had led them here. And Alana turned away then, walking back toward where the cruiser had pulled off, toward the direction of the parking lot that now felt farther than it had been, her steps steady, measured, each one grounded, the sound of her shoes against the pavement soft but clear in the quiet evening air. And behind her, the officers remained where they were, not speaking, not moving immediately, as if the moment required stillness before anything else could follow. The engine of the cruiser idling softly, the headlights casting a long beam across the road that stretched forward into the night. And as Alana continued walking, the light caught the edge of her silhouette for a brief second before she moved beyond it, into the natural dimness of the evening, where shapes softened and details blurred, but presence remained, and the road ahead lay open, not defined by what had happened, but informed by it, carrying forward the quiet weight of a moment that would not be erased, only remembered, only understood in time.